Now, why do they exist? Here's the challenge that we face. Are all of your source systems perfect? Do they have always referential integrity intact? Is all of your business keys arriving on time, or do you have late arriving records? Is every extract that you receive perfect every time, all the time? And do you have time to fix some of these issues? And so these are the challenges that we face, and these are realities we see in most organizations. And so, from those perspectives, these questions are somewhat rhetorical, but quite pertinent. So, what do we mean by all of this? Let's imagine that we've received some data that looks like the below. We have a client ID and a primary key, and that is great, except there's a null in it. Now, clearly, a primary key should never have a null in it, but here we do. So, uh, that may be the reality of the systems. It may be old, it may be poorly designed, it may have all sorts of other issues associated to that particular system, but it is possible. Now, a primary key is obviously mandatory. It's a primary key. It's supposed to give you the uniqueness within your records. The issue we face is if that is supposed to be the uniqueness within the record, we have values associated to this. In this case, it's 10,000 or $10 million. Uh, from that perspective, there is value associated to that record, but there is no primary key. That's an issue. We can't lose that data. We need to deal with it. So we're going to talk about how we deal with that in a moment. Here we have brokers and products and area identifiers or business keys, and they can be either fully qualified or sometimes they arrive at a different time and they arrive late. And so, from these perspectives, as these things change over time, and we'll talk about that particular technique a little bit later in our lecture, but how do we then identify or deal with these missing business keys? Not all platforms will allow you to do equi-joins or inner joins on missing data or missing keys, and therefore will fail or give you incorrect results. So, how do we make sure that our consumption is fully reconcilable and our ingestion can deal with these issues? So what we do with the null business key is we substitute those business keys. You know which are the business key columns. You are identifying them within your modeling exercises. So you identify your business keys. Your metadata are made aware or configured to know which columns are the business keys. So being able to substitute these particular values from null to a actual value of some sort to allow it technically to process and not miss any of the data, we have a dual requirement. The first requirement for those particular columns or business keys that are mandatory, typically expressed as a primary key. Not always, don't rely solely on the actual metadata, column metadata. You need to understand the actual data. You have to have your subject matter expert in the conversation. If you have a mandatory key, we substitute it with a value of -1. Why -1? Because it's typically not something you will find in a business key. Now, I've come across situations in organizations where -1s were used in key spaces and they were used as the indications of end of hierarchies. So your mileage may vary. If you have such a value, then pick another substitute, something that does not exist in your data. Very important. We'll talk about the requirements in a moment. But as far as that value is concerned, once you pick the value, it needs to be consistent. Now, why do we differentiate between mandatory business keys and give it a -1 and the optional business keys, the foreign keys, here as -2? Well, that comes down to the following. -1s, you may in fact have history. And if I go back to my example here, we have values associated to the client ID of $10 million in this case. So there is a descriptive record for this particular -1 record. And so there will be history for your -1 records. Whereas your -2 records, because they are associative in this case, they are not the identifying or the grain of the data, you will not have history associated to those. Instead, therefore, to differentiate between actual business key values and optional values as such, we can then say there are two different circumstances. They are not necessarily the same key, and therefore we differentiate on those values. So for the mandatory business keys, we substitute with the -1 or equivalent, depending on your data. For the optional business keys, we are substituting with a -2 or equivalence. You cannot have more than one -1 record per batch. Yes, you can encounter it many times, but obviously that will constitute a duplicate primary key, and therefore you're not only do you have nulls, you have duplicates in your inputs, and you'll have to deal with that at source or at extract. And that's not what this is trying to fix. It simply allows you to have some of the data that comes through in a somewhat broken state to still flow through without being touched. You can have any number of -2 records per batch because obviously it's not uniqueness in your data. It's typically not going to have any data associated with it. And so, hence the statement earlier of -1 records, you will expect to find a history over time, whereas -2, you won't. Again, like the business key collision code, you need to understand the behaviors of your data, and at modeling time, the designation of whether it's a -1 or -2 substitution is a modeling determination, and it must be captured in your metadata, in your automation frameworks to facilitate that. So what does this give us? It provides a consistent join capability. So to some degree, it it behaves or have similar characteristics as ghost records. Ghost records have a very specific purpose. Remember, it's for the timeline alignment, it's for the resetting the history at the consistent level, so we have the same depth of time in all structures. But you can't do the join on a null value. You need some sort of record. So this gives you consistent join capability, and it also maintains auditability. Yes, we are substituting the null business keys with a particular value, but that value is reserved for that purpose and that purpose only. So it cannot appear in your existing data streams. It needs to be something unique. Pick a character or a combination of characters for this purpose that does not appear in your data. With a value assigned when you consume it, and you do the joins when you have null values and equi-joins or inner joins, those are typically ignored or lost in the result. And therefore, if it in fact allows you to do that, not all platforms allow you to do null value inner joins, but your mileage may vary. Either way, the records would drop out of the result and therefore give you either an incomplete or incorrect result. With the substitutions in place, it now gives you something that technically will not cause you any reconciliation issues. So this is null business keys dealing with the realities of poorly formed data as they arise.